Well, good afternoon, everybody, and it's my pleasure to introduce Deane Marchbein, who actually does not require any introduction, but I'll give you a little introduction to her. Anyway, so Deane is a physician. She was an anesthesiologist for many years at Partners at Mass General, and then since 2005, she has been working with Doctors Without Borders, or Médecins Sans Frontières, and she was on the board of the organization for the US from 2007 to 2016, was the president and vice president, and now is on the board for the international organization for this very important organization. And she has been on multiple assignments for them, more than 25. There were 25 2 years ago, and she still goes every year, at least to one. So anyway, she's going to tell us now about one of the experiences when she was in Cairo. And Deane, we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much for your interest and for that very kind introduction. So I'd like to talk about my most recent experience in Cairo. But first, I need to talk a little bit about Doctors Without Borders. So Doctors Without Borders is a medical humanitarian organization, and as such, it's bound by medical ethics to treat everyone without regard to race, ethnicity, politics, or gender. And we seek to treat the most vulnerable populations and are guided by the principles of neutrality, impartiality, and independence. But often those are really aspirational. They're in our charter. We work every day to fulfill our charter, but given the context in which we work, sometimes our neutrality and our impartiality can be questioned just on the basis of where we're physically located. So the organization was founded in 1971 in the wake of the conflict in Biafra. And Biafra was at that point a breakaway state in Nigeria. And at the time, the idea of neutrality and impartiality was understood to mean you did your work, but you didn't speak about what you were seeing. And what they were seeing were really, it was a political crisis. There was a blockade around the state of Biafra so that food wasn't getting in. And so there was massive starvation of small children, who are, of course, the most vulnerable. And the founders of Doctors Without Borders, when I talk about Doctors Without Borders, by the way, I will always refer to it by the French Médecins Sans Frontières, or MSF. So when I say MSF, you'll know that I'm really saying Doctors Without Borders. So the founders of MSF wanted a different kind of organization, one where they would not only deliver medical care, but also bear witness to what they were seeing. In the French, it's témoignage. And in effect, today, what I'm doing now is témoignage. I'm speaking to you about what I saw. So you'll notice that we work in more than 70 countries around the world. This is a slide from 2021. And by expenditure, a lot of that is in sub-Saharan Africa. So you'll notice that 47% of the expenses, the donation, the money, goes to countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Quite a bit to the Middle East, a little bit to Asia and Pacific, now increasingly more in the Americas and in Europe, given the migration crisis. And the other, I believe, is Oceania. Of the 5 country projects that received the most expenditure, 4 of the 5 are in sub-Saharan Africa. So what's the work that we do? So what you see here is a pictured massive flooding emergency in South Sudan in 2019 along the banks of the Nile and its tributaries. And while there is flooding every year along the banks of the Nile, this was a flood for the ages. And it's my opinion that if I were to present this slide to you in another 3 years, it would be labeled differently. It would be labeled the climate emergency, the climate disaster that it is. And in point of fact, a lot of the natural disasters that we're seeing, are studies going on now to understand the push-pull of migration, of conflicts, of wars, to see what the role is that climate has to play. But I'm not a climate specialist. I'm not going to talk to you about climate. This is my personal opinion. So this is another picture of what's called an environmental disaster. And actually, natural disasters are really a pretty small part of what MSF does. But we're able to quickly respond because often we have teams that are already in the fields in the places that those things are happening. So you can imagine that there are many, many challenges of delivering aid and medical care in a place where the roads are washed out, the airports are clogged, and the towns have been reduced to rubble. How do you treat patients in that circumstance? How do you even get supplies in to do it? It's really, sometimes I think about MSF as being a logistics organization with a medical focus, because honestly, the logs are my heroes. Epidemics are another area that we are chronically involved in. We're often on standby, as the areas in which we work in sub-Saharan Africa, across the Sahel, often have outbreaks of measles, meningitis, cholera. And they're often in countries where we are frequently working. But in 2019, 2020, as you know, there was a global pandemic, and MSF found itself working in an unlikely place, still focused on the most vulnerable. And in this case, it was Indian nations. So, and the reason for that is both social and historic. So they have their own health services that are often not well resourced, but more importantly, they often live in multi-generational families and do jobs where people cannot work remotely. And so if one person is going out to earn a living and coming back, the most vulnerable, obviously, grandma and grandpa are often affected. And so the Indian Health Services reached out to us and asked if we could help. And indeed, this is what we do, this is what we did. But in addition to COVID treatment center, we also provided sanitation services for the homeless in New York City. So malnutrition, and I spoke about that in Biafra. There's increasing discussion among the leadership of MSF about how we deal with malnutrition. Traditionally, we treat malnutrition as the disease that it is. It's not just about hunger and missing an occasional meal. It's a very serious medical issue, especially for children and increasingly for elderly adults. But the ethics of treating the affected individuals without dispensing food to the whole community has left us wondering whether this is feasible, whether this is a reasonable thing to do, or whether we need to reconsider our positioning on that. And so there are discussions ongoing about that. And then when you seek to treat the most vulnerable, included in that group are those who are excluded from healthcare. And some of those excluded are people who have fallen through the cracks, like street children, but also they include prisoners and they include migrants. Which brings me to the next slide of forced displacement. So there are more than 80 million human beings on the move globally who are on the move because of forced migration, because of conflict, because of gang violence, because of food and water insecurity, perhaps caused by climate change, but in any case, people on the move. Increasingly, in addition to the indignities and the real terror that they suffer along the route, that suffering of leaving your home, which I'm here to tell you nobody really does because they want to. They do it because they feel that they have no other choice for themselves and their family. But also increasingly governments are, despite signing the UN conventions on acceptance of refugees, governments around the world, including our own, have gone out of their way to make it impossible for people to enter and claim asylum. And so this is a global terror to people on the move. The threats that they include on their journey include lack of access to clean water, food, shelter, personal safety, and importantly, health care. And finally, armed conflict, which occupies more than half of our global budget. And today, the story that I want to tell you is the story that's really the intersection of armed conflict, forced displacement, and people who were excluded from healthcare and services. And so the story that I want to share is a project in Egypt, but its history dates back to another project that I worked on in 2012 in Libya. In 2012, Libya was in the middle of essentially a civil war. And MSF was unable to get access to people in areas controlled by the then leader Gaddafi. And so our only access to the Libyan population was through Egyptian colleagues. And so we essentially our teams traveled from east to west as the then putative rebels occupied more territory. And during that entire time, obviously, we were not neutral and impartial. We were traveling with the rebels. And during that whole time, there was an ongoing conversation with the leadership saying, we're neutral, we're impartial. We know that you have prisoners. We know that there are people on the other side who could use our services. Please give us access. And for a long time, they ignored us. But at some point, there's an expression in Arabic that says, are you with us or with them? And by virtue of having traveled essentially with them for 6 months, have experienced the nightly shelling and bombing, they concluded we were with them and that we said what we did what we said, and that they could trust us. And so they gave us access to the prisons and their prisoners. And if you look at the little divot to the east of Sirte and to the west of Masra, I was the prison doctor in the town of Misrata. We arrived by ship from Malta because the airports weren't accessible to us. And this is a picture of the main street in Misrata. This is Tripoli, and it gives you a sense of how destroyed the town was. Everything was in shambles. It was a prison. It was a medical project, so I was working for the Belgians at the time, and we were providing medical service in 2 prisons, one that looked like an official prison, and the other, which is the one that I spent most of my time in, was a converted school. And the French were running a hospital, and once they discovered that I was an anesthesiologist and knew how to pre-op patients and choose the patients for surgery and read x-rays, I basically determined the OR schedule. But part of my responsibility was not only deciding who needed surgery and when they should go. The leadership in the town of Misrata obviously didn't trust their prisoners to be sort of wandering off and getting themselves to the hospital. And in point of fact, nor did the prisoners feel safe outside of the hospital. They knew that they weren't going to be hurt outside of the hospital. So one of my responsibilities was daily to drive with the prisoners to the hospital, deliver them if they were having day surgery or if someone else needed to get back, to accompany them back to the hospital. Basically, MSF was trusted by the authorities and trusted to do that. So the prisoners may not be what you typically think of as combatants. They certainly weren't for me. The bald guy at the far right was a functionary in a power plant for more than 2 decades, working for the then official government of Libya. He didn't think of himself as a Gaddafi supporter, but when the conflict broke out, by virtue of having worked for the government, he was assigned the label of being a combatant. He was injured. He found his way to the hospital. The next guy was even less a Gaddafi supporter, but once again, this was a fruit picker. He picked oranges. And when the conflict broke out, he was trying to make his way home to Sudan. And his fault was to pay for food he was trying to buy with government script. And that identified him as part of the Gaddafi loyalist team. And he was injured. The person who ran the prison warden was an amazing humanitarian. He was a teacher, and he said, I did not pick up arms to fight for my country. Now I can provide a safe place for people to heal and to come back together. And he was wonderful to work with. But within 6 months of Gaddafi being captured and killed, things changed, and they went from bad to worse. And the prison warden that I worked with was sort of edged out. And in his place was a man who believed that his job was to torture the prisoners. And MSF found itself in the uncomfortable position of patching people up medically so that they could be tortured again. And obviously, this was not something that we were willing to do. We loudly closed the project and left, but in doing so, it started a discussion about what we should be doing. So we knew that people were being tortured, and they weren't just being tortured in Libya. There was torture going on all over the world. MSF at that point had no experience dealing with survivors of torture, but we figured we better figure it out. We also realized that we were used to treating people who were displaced and in refugee camps, but now there were literally millions and millions of people on the move, not in refugee camps, who needed care along the way, and finding ways to have a safe medical record, data protection, finding a way to give them the medical record so that it could go with them, or doing it electronically so that they could access it wherever they went, was one of the things that we needed to do and have learned to do. And then we also needed to realize that we needed to address the suffering of those on the move. And the suffering includes hunger, it includes lack of safety, safe housing, certainly medical care, but among the most vulnerable are victims of sexual violence. And Egypt was the obvious place for us to be. If you look at this map, you see Egypt sits right sort of at the head of the Red Sea. So people coming from Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea, Yemen may make their way up the Red Sea. And then there's the course of the Nile, which I'm sure you know goes right through Cairo. And people from Sudan, South Sudan, often will follow the trajectory of the Nile. And if you look at the distribution of our patients in the Mahdi project, in the Cairo project in 2021, you see that the vast majority of them are from Sudan, a lot from Ethiopia, Eritrea, South Sudan, and Somalia. And those from Sudan are often Darfuris. So going back to the map, you might ask a legitimate question: where were the people from Syria? Why were we not seeing people from Syria, which is not very far from Egypt? And the answer to that is about race and economics. The Syrians who were in Egypt largely left Syria with a lot of wealth intact. And so they were able to strike a deal with the Egyptian government so that their children had access to schools and they had access to health care. But additionally, they largely saw themselves as white. And the last thing that they would want to do is to sit in a waiting room with a bunch of sub-Saharan Africans. That just wasn't going to happen. And since MSF seeks to treat the most vulnerable, we positioned our clinic in Maadi, which is sort of a suburb of Cairo that has lots and lots of immigrants. So operating in Egypt is not the easiest thing in the world. MSF has been in Egypt since 2000 when we had a Kal-Azar project, but it was not until 2011 that we were actually registered there, and that was related to the Libyan conflict. So in 2017, the Egyptian government, in the guise of an anti-terrorism move, kicked most of the international NGOs out of the country. Mostly they were NGOs dealing with human rights, and importantly, MSF does not see itself as a human rights organization. But we were forced to maintain a very low profile. So our cars don't have the logo on it, our houses, our apartments, our clinics, none of those have the insignia on it. And that's fine, except that when you work in a community and people know that there's something going on, but they don't know what that something is, they tend to be suspicious and hostile. So, but also there's the problem of how do you make yourself known to the community that you're hoping to serve. So mostly that was word of mouth, and hopefully I'll have time to share what some efforts that we made to change that a little bit. But the restraints were also explicit constraints. So we were only allowed to have 10% international staff, which is sort of normal. Every one of me, there are 9 or 10 locally hired staff. But in the case of Egypt, there was another thing going on, and that is, even though Egypt was a signatory to the UN Convention on Refugees, and even though they allowed refugees to be there, they did not allow them to work. So there are 200,000 registered refugees in Egypt, probably double that number of unregistered, and frankly, we needed them for our work because the populations that we serve, from Somalia, from Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, often they did not speak Arabic. So the idea that you were going to hire local Arabic speakers and somehow be able to communicate with these people was fantasy. So much as MSF really prefers to be following the laws of the country, it was really not possible. And so one of the things that we had to do was figure out a way to pay taxes for all of these employees without specifically listing them. And fortunately, finance was not my area of responsibility. So what you see here pictured is a nurse, the intercultural mediator, the intercultural mediators were way more than translators, and the patient. And all of the pictures I will be showing you, you will not be able to identify the people for their privacy, for their dignity. We've grown in that respect. A number of years ago, I might have shown you pictures that were perfectly identifiable, and now we really try not to. And officially, unless I've taken the picture myself, they will not be identified. But to tell you a little story about how important the intercultural mediators are, there was a young woman who came in, and she was practicing Muslim and from Sudan, and she just said she had been raped. And she said, there's no way I can carry this baby to term. I want to kill myself, but I have to carry this baby to term because it's a sin against Islam to take a soul. And the intercultural mediator found her way forward. She said to her, according to Islam, the baby does not have a soul until he's 40 days old. And so if you terminate this pregnancy before 40 days, if you choose to do that, then you will not be taking a soul. It will not be a sin against Islam. And the intercultural mediator wasn't telling her what to do, but she was giving her a way to think about it so that the young woman could actually weigh her own options and make her own decisions about what she wanted to do. So the project is a project for victims of sexual violence as well as survivors of torture. And since nearly 90% of our patients were victims of sexual violence, I'm only going to talk about that. But the first thing I need to say to you in talking about victims of sexual violence is that not all of the victims are women. Homosexuals are at great risk. Those with binary sexual preferences, those who are transsexual, are extremely at risk. And if you look at this diagram with our data from the first quarter of 2022, you'll see that nearly 20% of the cases were minors, meaning people younger than 18 years old. About 10% of them, 10% of them were LGBTQ. And although most of the cases were women, 24%, nearly a quarter of the cases were young men. And I don't know that I did the next, yeah. So if you look at this next graphic, although 79% were victims of sexual violence once, that means that 21% were victims multiple times. And there are many reasons why that might be so. Being a victim of sexual violence, the causative factors of that, the things that produce the vulnerability are complicated. But first of all, migrants and refugees traveling sometimes are obliged to trade so-called sexual favors for food and housing. Sometimes it's not a trade at all. Sometimes it's just out and out taken from them. But also, access to a safe place to live is really one of the biggest problems. So if someone is the victim of sexual violence in their communities, sometimes, often, the perpetrator is someone who has a lot of power relative to the victim. And so we see cases where you move the victim to another setting and the perpetrator is able to find them and do it again. There was a mother with 2 young sons whose husband died, and because she had sons, I'm not sure I have the story exactly right, the second wife, who had no children with the husband, wanted the first wife, who had the children, to relinquish her claim on his money. And so she arranged for the kidnapping and rape of the then 13-year-old boy. And we found the boy, rescued them. Oh, by the way, the Egyptian police, unless there's a dead body, could really care about a bunch of refugees. So they were not interested at all. This effort to salvage the kid had to be done privately. Well, with the UNHCR's help, they were moved, but then the perpetrator found them again and grabbed the kid again and was sending the mother videos of her kid being raped, saying, "You do what I want, or we will do worse." So although my job as the project coordinator was certainly not to find beds for people, I realized that the fact that MSF does not provide housing was an increasing problem, because sometimes people would come in at 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and by the time you realized that they needed a safe place overnight, all of the other agencies or collaborating NGOs were closed, and often my team would be in the clinic till 11 o'clock at night trying to sort things out. So housing turns out to be a very significant problem. So although sexual violence does not only include women, for a moment I want to talk about sexual violence and treatment for women. And I have to talk about abortion and safe abortion if I'm going to talk about providing health care to victims, female victims of sexual violence. And why am I talking about abortion? In 2021, the UN estimated that there are 1.26 million women who suffer mortality, death, because of complications of pregnancy. And the fifth leading cause of this mortality is unsafe abortion. And so if you're going to provide essential health care to women, particularly victims of sexual violence, it absolutely has to include abortion, access to safe abortion. So MSF wasn't always so good about this. In 2016, we realized that although we said we were providing abortion on demand, in fact, if the logistician didn't order the medicines, we weren't able to provide abortion. If the project coordinator, my job, decided it was too dangerous for the team, we weren't doing it. And in 2016, MSF made a concerted effort to train all of us on the importance of this service. And oh, by the way, any medical personnel could not work in a location if they were in certain locations if they were unwilling to do this. That needed to be expanded to all kinds of people because it's not just medical people that become heads of country managers and project coordinators. But the first thing I would want to say to you about abortion care in 2022 is it's not the same as abortion care in 1970. Most abortions up to 22 weeks are medicine-based. So it's a matter of giving medicine. It's a matter of recognizing who is eligible for it, that they don't have other complicating factors that you would want to not do it. And then the complications of it are impossible to recognize from a spontaneous miscarriage. And so then you just need to have a conversation with a woman that if she needs to go to the hospital, under no circumstances can she say that this is a medically induced abortion. But in a context of a very conservative society where abortion is illegal, how do you actually do that? How do you even have the conversation with people to tell them that this is available and to help them decide? And so it's one of many risks that MSF needs to mitigate and manage. I don't actually, I'm the person who they sent walking across the border from Turkey into Syria, pretending not to be an American, working at a trauma hospital. So MSF is really used to mitigating risk and dealing with them. So in my view, dealing with the risk of this is no different than any of the other half dozen risks that we need to deal with. But it is complicated. So in my team in Mahdi, there were 4 teams. There was the blue team, the yellow team, the green team, and the red team. And they were a multidisciplinary team. So there was a social worker, a nurse, a doctor, and multiple intercultural mediators because they needed to speak a variety of languages. And then there was the super secret purple team that no one knew about. And the doctor on the purple team was the expat. And the assumption was that if something happened, if the Egyptian government got wind of it, if we needed to get her out quickly, we could just quickly get her off to the airport and she would be safe. But I'm here to tell you that none of the other people on that team had that privilege. And one evening I invited them to my flat so that they could have a conversation about what they were doing, how it was going, how to improve things. And I posed the question to the other members of the team. And it really warms my heart to report to you their response. To a person, they said, this is really important work. Women should have the right to the health care that they need. And so that's why we're doing it. But having the conversation, and it's really kind of delicate, and it was my opinion that this was kind of an open secret, that yes, it was the super secret team, but I was pretty sure that it was widely known. First of all, for me to postulate that the Egyptian government doesn't know what we're doing, I have to postulate that they're pretty incompetent at what they do, and nothing else in my experience with that government has led me to believe that they're incompetent. So I come to an alternate conclusion, is that we weren't corrupting the Egyptians. And so if there were a few less of those refugee types to take care of, so much the better. I was pretty sure that the Egyptian doctors in our clinic knew about it, because occasionally they would refer a patient to the expat doctor without having first done a pregnancy test. And the only thing that the expat doctor did that was different from the national staff doctors was provide abortions. But I had my conclusive evidence on the afternoon that the Purple Team was meeting at my apartment, when I said to my then assistant, who I really wanted to be part of this, but she wasn't part of the Purple Team, so tell me what you know about abortion. And she looked at me, she said, do you mean in Egypt or in MSF? And so that basically told me everything that I needed to know. And I applied to Brussels, so the head of mission, with the permission and the help of the head of mission, we started organizing group discussions of not necessarily just the medical personnel, but our locally hired leadership in the community, to understand from them what they saw as the risk, what they thought they could discuss in the community, where we could discuss abortion, where we couldn't, because the community didn't even know broadly that we were providing healthcare to victims of sexual violence. Additionally, with the support of the country manager, who's called the head of mission, who is just a dream to work. If I could have sat at his feet, his leadership skills were just incredible. In the month that I worked with him, I really just learned so much. We asked Brussels to provide an EVA training, which is their training about health services for sexual violence. And I was just in Brussels last week, and I was talking to the desk medical referent who was responsible for the project, and she reported to me that in September, indeed, they did the EVA training. 90 people received the training, including cleaning staff, including drivers, including logisticians. And normally at the end of the 3-day EVA training, they will ask if anyone wants to participate further. And normally, apparently, 2, 3, sometimes 5 people will volunteer. 20 people volunteered to be further involved in this care. So I'm going to stop here and take your questions. Yeah.
It would seem that the United States would qualify as a totally undeveloped country under your criteria of just talking about abortions. And how do you deal with this? Does MSF run up against this in dealing with the United States? You mentioned the Native American situations on the reservations, but how about this additional?
So we are looking at that. What we don't want to be doing is draining resources from other smaller local organizations that are actually better positioned to do this. So right now, there's an ongoing conversation with a lot of local organizations to see how we can support them. But we've talked about mobile clinics being set up at the borders of states where it's legal, states where it's not. I think it's, honestly, I think it's going to be really difficult to control access to medication, termination of pregnancy in the United States, unless you're prepared to go through everybody's mail. We've also talked about telemedicine so that you're doing a proper evaluation of people. But basically, what we don't want to do is, we're the big guys. And what we don't need to be doing is draining resources and attention away from from people who have been doing this for a long time and are doing it well. We need to support them. Yeah.
So, as usual, that was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And we really admire what your organization does. I guess I have two questions. One is, I'm sure that you need even more resources than you already have. And secondly, how do you handle where you have the situation like in Ukraine, where it must draw a lot of resources, and what do you do about the rest of your responsibilities around the world?
So your second question is a really important question, because the world is focused on Ukraine now. And and I would say, relative to the needs in Ukraine and relative to the work that's going on in Ukraine, we are playing a relatively small part. It's important. We're running a train from Zaporizhia to Lviv with injured people so that they can get it's a medical train, so they're getting medical care on the train as they're being transported. We're working with, when I worked in Ukraine before this version of the conflict. I worked in eastern Ukraine running mobile clinics. And basically it was to elderly people who were left behind, wouldn't move, couldn't move. And those are still the people who are most vulnerable. We're doing that. However, right now there are 5 of our 6 operational centers who are involved in Ukraine. And there is a discussion about maybe 3 of them not being there because Yemen is having a horrible disaster. There's Ebola again in eastern Congo. Pakistan had floods of the ages. And these are places that the rest of the world kind of goes, eh. And so it's up to us as the big guys to go where others are not going. So in fact, humanitarian workers aren't all that different from other people. Like when I was sent to Egypt, where I really wanted to go was Ukraine, and I was pretty unhappy that the person I replaced had the job that I wanted in Ukraine. He was running the train. So when there is what we call a CNN emergency, everybody wants to do that, and the rest of the world, and frankly, sometimes our own people, deprioritize other parts of the world. And fortunately, the leadership does not. And so there is a constant discussion about where really are the most vulnerable, where are the resources needed. And fortunately, I'm going to go to a slide that I made about our funding. And because 94% of our funding comes from individuals, we have the flexibility to go where we think it's needed. To make a restricted donation to MSF, first of all, before they'll accept it, they need to know that they can actually use that amount of money. So with respect to Ukraine, for instance, last year, the general directors of each of the 5 operating centers got together, and they realized that in the coming year, all that they could properly use was 40 million USD. And so that was all they would accept as restricted money. And on one hand, I was furious. What do you mean there are these great needs and all you can accept is $40 million? There's more work to be done. On the other hand, I have to respect them for saying, these are the limits of what we can absorb, and we're not going to be dishonest and say we're going to use your money for something that we really can't use it for. So we have a lot of freedom because of our independence largely comes from our financial independence. Yeah? Micro.
How much is the Board of Trustees, or who is handling these questions? Because it sounds remarkable how serious it is to follow an extremely thought through declaration of what your job is.
These are people who do this. This is their work. So it's not the board of directors.
Okay.
The board of directors provides oversight to make sure that we said what we're going to do and we do what we said we're going to do, and that the things that we do are consistent with our charter. But there, in each operational center, there's a medical director called a Dear Med, there's an operational director called a Dear Op, and a general director. Those are the people who are tasked with talking to the desk managers, to the people in the field, to figure out. They spend their lives looking at the global situation. They come together. They sometimes even make decisions collaboratively, and make decisions about what they're going to do.
Are they the ones who decided $40 million for Ukraine?
That they were the ones who said, this is all we can absorb.
Okay, so you're telling me what I want to know, who runs it.
Okay. Mitch?
Wow.
Yeah.
What a place to work.
It is. It's really my privilege.
But what huge work you have to do. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's my privilege.
I
Mitch?
don't know if you're involved in it, but I've been reading they're trying to, since abortion is now illegal in Mexico, it's legal, they want to set up clinics all along the border to go there. Are you familiar with that? Are you guys working with them on that? Because these poor women in Texas, it's a big state. They have checkpoints and they can't get through. So
I won't speak about politics. I'll just nod my head.
Any other questions?
Yeah,
I'm coming.
wait for the micro.
You mentioned sanitation in New York. Could you say more about that? I'm
Sure,
curious.
sure. So the homeless people, when COVID started, everything was closed, and so the normal places that they would go to clean, and so we set up showers and toilets, and we're dispensing toothbrushes and soap and stuff like that, so that people and masks, so that homeless people, could be a little more careful.
So how do they deal with the ethical decisions they have to make? Because it's mind-boggling to me anyway.
We are human beings making ethical decisions, and sometimes we make good ones, and sometimes we make decisions that are less good. And I think for me, it's important to try, and I'm much more generous with people who try and fail than people who don't try. Okay.
From what you said about that discussion, that question, it strikes me that MSF is good in the sense of it not being bureaucratic and being limited by IRBs and so on to make decisions. And is that a model for us, how to move forward?
Oh, I don't know if I'm a model or we're a model for anything, but I think it gives us a degree of flexibility. The fact that it's not so much IRBs, it's more grants to do specific things. For a very high-profile international NGO that's based in Boston that will not be named, they decide their projects based on where they have money to do it. And I think that's a very backwards way to make your decisions. But when you need grants for what you're going to do, let me share a story that really typifies that. When I was at the start of the Syrian conflict in 2011, I was the medical coordinator for project in Syria, a cross-border project. We had no access to people, and I was based in Beirut. And so one of my jobs was to deliver food money to an imam in the northeast part of Syria, of Lebanon, right near the Syrian border. And the imam took me around. He showed me what he was doing. I talked to women who had walked over the mountains. It was winter, in the snow, with the clothes on their back, sometimes with small children, sometimes alone, who were opening their pill boxes for me so that I could see what medicines they were on, because my job was to try to figure out what medicines we wanted to be stocking so that we could help take care of them. The imam showed me around, and they were all being housed in local community houses, not in a refugee camp. And I said, okay, so I'm authorized to pay for milk and bread for 100 people each week. And he got this really sour look on his face, and he said, yeah, I know. You have to go back and write a grant, and you'll get back to me to see if you can actually do it. I said, no, I have the money in my pocket. We're going to the baker so that I can pay this week's fee, and we're going to buy the milk now. These people are hungry now. They don't need me to go back and write a grant. And he was just amazed and dazzled, but that's the flexibility that 94% of independently raised funds gives you. So let me, I couldn't have placed you better in the audience. This is how you do it. I wouldn't show it unless you ask, but since you've shown it, you go online to Doctors Without Borders, MSF, and you can donate.
Is that going to be if we go on Dr. Are they going to have that?
Yeah, all of that will be there on their website. Use the micro, please.
Wherever you went to, that you were going to bow at the feet of the person who you were being worked with, I can only say I would like to bow at your feet for what you've done in your life.
Thank you.
So, Deane, I have this question. Are you ever afraid?
So that's a complicated question. I am basically a coward. I'm always afraid. My husband will tell you that 2 days before I'm traveling to Brussels, I stop eating and I get nervous. It's just not a reason to stop. The only time I've ever been seriously afraid for my life was in the Congo. And there were rumors, where we were positioned was at the border between two different groups. And normally that provides you a modicum of safety because both sides need you. But it was getting a little testy, and I was then the anesthesiologist, and the project coordinator was reducing the size of the team. So the team was going to be evacuated, but she was planning to stay and gave the surgeon and I the option of staying. And I said, I'm staying. And the surgeon looked at me and goes, if she's staying, I'm staying. And that night, there were gunshots really, really close. And I didn't sleep that night. By the next day, it was calm, nothing happened. But it was a moment in my life when I realized that stuff can happen. And my point of view on all of this is I'm basically a coward. I'm a wuss. But if I believe in this work and I think someone should be doing it, why should that not be me? So that's, yeah.
So this is more mundane, but I just want to say about donations. You can donate from donor funds, and you can also donate from your IRA if you can arrange it and go to that.
So, and the other thing is there's now someone in charge of people prospectively donating after they die and designating part of their estate. And that's another thing that people do.
One thing that concerns me is that I've been donating for years, and I would say I get 3 pieces of requests every week, 3 or 4.
I hate that.
And I'm concerned about the money that goes into that.
So I share your concern. And I have sent them a message from me saying, if you send me more than 1 request a year, you will get no money from me.
That's what I do.
One more question.
And that works?
We're running this way.
So MSF is a really fine organization. You do great work, Deane, and the organization does great work. And you're donating based on what you know they do. But I'd like to be sure that people don't take grant requests differently, don't take IRBs differently. You do not want research that's just being done willy-nilly by organizations you don't know about and that have not been properly vetted by IRBs, which means institutional review boards. That you can have an organization like this, and those of us who believe in universal health care, believe that abortion's a part of universal health care, we should donate to organizations like this and let them do their work. But when you're being taxed and your money is going to be put through various grants, you want to see that if it's a health grant, that a group of reasonable physicians are reviewing this and not doing Tuskegee experiments and things that have occurred in the past that have just been horrible on the basis of, quote, research.
So you should know that MSF does not do a lot of research, but when it does, it has an IRB. That is essential for human experimentation. So we had access to the first Ebola treatments, and in the heat of the Ebola epidemic, we were trying to set up research on what worked and what didn't. There was absolutely an IRB. When you're doing human experimentation, that's the only ethical thing to do. But IRBs don't relate to funding for providing vaccines for in a measles epidemic. It's not the same terminology. It's not the same process. But also, I think that it's important that you are sure that whatever organizations you donate to, you have confidence in their accountability. Because honestly, money is fungible. And the idea that you give money for one thing that won't be used for that thing, or you give money to an organization that has huge administrative costs, that's not something that you actually want to be doing with your hard-earned money. So thank you all.
So I just want to say thank you on behalf of all of us. It was wonderful.
Thanks very much. Thanks for listening.